Hey, check it out. Beautiful 4K. Captain McVeigh was the commanding officer of the USS Indianapolis in World War II. Nicknamed the Indy, the Indianapolis was responsible for delivering a clandestine payload to a small island north of Guam called Tinian. This small payload was one of the 2 atomic bombs that would be dropped on Japan. The mission pretty much went without a hitch, but on the return home, they came in contact with a Japanese sub and ultimately capsized and sank. Now, the story becomes even more harrowing when you realize that over the course of the next several days, the Indianapolis on this clandestine mission, which was ordered to maintain radio silence, did not have the opportunity to be able to appropriately notify authorities of their situation. There were some attempts at making a mayday call. However, due to the nature of the mission, there was miscommunication on whether it was an actual mayday call or whether it was some trick by the enemy. At the end of the day, 3/4 of the crew would end up dying, and Captain McVeigh would carry that burden for most of his life. This was complicated by the fact that after the war, due to political agendas and several other factors, he would be court-martialed, and he would actually end up being the only commanding officer in the history of the Navy to be court-martialed for losing his ship in war. This was something that he continued to carry with him until eventually, in his later years, he took his life. Regret can be something that nags at us. It's something that eats away at us, especially regret that occurs when we were really honestly trying to do the right thing. That is a very difficult thing to handle. Situations where we feel like we weren't doing the wrong thing, or at least at the time we were trying to do our best to do the right thing, but things just didn't work out right. That can be something that sticks with us and it nags at us. None of us want to be the villain in the movie that plays inside of our own heads, and so because of that, when we end up looking at the wake of destruction that sometimes happens due to our own misinterpretation of things or due to our own weaknesses, that can be very hard for us to tolerate, and we can carry that for a very long time. It is precisely these types of regrets that we end up looking at the apostles, and suddenly they become very, very familiar. You see, a lot of the apostles did things that ended up causing them a deep sense of regret. I mean, immediately after Jesus Christ was arrested, you ended up seeing a lot of the disciples scattering and running, and you end up seeing the denial of Christ that, Peter did, where, Jesus predicted that the crow would call 3 times, and Peter would end up denying Christ 3 times. And as a result, Peter was ashamed of himself. There was a deep sense of regret there. Regret is just kind of a natural part of life. We're all fallible people, and as a result of that, no matter how hard we try to do the right thing in the right way and to respond with the right type of reaction to the circumstances around us, we are destined to do dumb things. That's just kind of who we are. That's the nature of being a clumsy, mortal human being. So how do we handle this? How do we, in our minds, kind of parse this deep sense of nagging regret with how we feel like Christ is calling us to act? Well, in your small groups, you'll read here in a second about how Paul processes this, and I really like his take on it because he separates the ideas of grief from regret. You see, regret is something that nags at you. It's something that doesn't even have anything to do with the situation happening right then and there. The situation may be something that happened weeks ago, months ago, years ago, where all other parties have already moved past it, but yet we carry that with us because we realize that we were the bad guy in the movie that played in our own heads, that we really were the villain and we just can't get over that. That's different than looking at the destruction that may happen at the result of our own actions and say, I grieve for those people. I have compassion for these individuals, and I grieve over the fact that I may have done something to cause these individuals harm. But here's the catch. As long as we are doing our best to try to do the right thing, to discern what God is calling us to do in different situations, then we are enabled to be able to live without that sense of regret. We can avoid that sense of regret because we understand that God called us to do a thing, and when He called us to do that thing, He knew how we were going to screw up. He knew that he was going to make something good out of that situation. And so even though we can grieve out of our sense of compassion or sense of love for other individuals, the fact that we may have caused somebody else harm, we should be careful not to let that grief become something that eats away at us, that ends up deteriorating our hearts and our minds. And that may actually cause us to be hesitant and afraid to act when God is calling us once again to put our neck out there and to act in a situation where we may not be so certain that we have the tools to do the right thing. English kind of being the clumsy language it is, this distinction between grief and regret isn't exactly perfect, but I do think it helps us in a practical sense through the different situations in our lives. Now, we're not necessarily talking about regret over each and every single thing we've done because, hey, every now and then we do things and we know that we're doing something wrong. And that's kind of a separate conversation. But specifically, when we're going into situations where we say, you know what, I didn't think I was doing something wrong. I just wasn't thinking of other people. I wasn't, thinking about the full ramifications of what I would actually do. That is the kind of thing that we can carry with us. And that is the kind of thing that we end up looking at Christ and saving people from throughout his ministry. Think about the number of times he approached individuals who were living with regret over the fact that, they were actively participating in being a cheat and a liar, as we read in our Bibles, a tax collector. We end up seeing individuals who were whores and prostitutes that Christ, looked down and said, I don't judge you anymore. We see Christ constantly going to people and pulling them out of their sense of regret, pulling them into a life of hope, into this world where there's a future, where that past doesn't nag at them and eat away at them anymore. That doesn't mean that they're callous to the needs of other individuals. It simply means that they're not going to let those past actions be something that sits there as an anchor around their neck and causes them to slowly drown in their own despair. That should be something that is very relieving. It should be something that is very beautiful. At the same time, we have to be careful not to go too far in the other direction and simply state that because Christ, I can do anything I want. Because Christ, I don't need to worry about the consequences of my actions. And because Christ, if somebody else has a problem with what I have to say, I know I'm doing the right thing and that's on them. Because there's always such a thing as learning from our grief, and that's something else that Paul addresses. He talks about actually growing because of grief, being willing to actually deal and process your grief. This is something that just on a practical sense makes a tremendous amount of sound reason. To sit here and look at the ways that we interact with other people and say, you know what, even if I think I did the right thing, even if in my mind as a matter of justice, I think that I couldn't have done anything any better than I did, let's say for example, then you can still look at things and say, but could I maybe taken a different approach? Is there a different tact I could have taken? Are there areas where maybe I got forced into reacting a certain way that I could have avoided? There are always things that we can learn to grow as individuals, to become people who are more sensitive and more in tune to the needs around us. This becomes a critical part of meeting people as Christians with where they are. Because frequently there may be something that on a sheet of paper, if we were to just pull a bunch of random Bible verses, we could say, you know what, I have the right to do this, and this individual is wrong here, here, and here. However, as a matter of doing as Christ did, it may not be the most prudent. It may not be the most compassionate to sit here and beat somebody over the head with, what they're doing wrong, or it may not be the most gracious thing to sit here and constantly remind somebody of where they're wrong just because we think we're helping them become a better person. We have to be sensitive enough to see when we have grieved other individuals, and then we have to be sensitive enough to actually grieve that effect ourselves. And in that grief, we should be wise enough to actually discern where God is calling us to be better people, to be better disciples, and to be better reflections of the gentle and compassionate nature that Jesus Christ himself exemplified here on this earth. When we look at how Christ actually executed his own ministry and his own interactions with other people, you can see the differences between this idea of grief and regret. when you look at the famous example that I know in this church we seem to bring up all the time, which is Jesus and the woman at the well, you can see Jesus clearly pointing out where this individual had done different things, where her actions had impacted other people, and actually working through those things and talking through them, forcing her to actually confront what she actually did so that she could deal with that grief of her own actions, but yet at the same time was quick to point out that there is no sense of regret because Christ has provided retribution. Christ has provided rehabilitation, and Christ has provided that resurrection from the things that seek to pull us down. You see, Christ carries our burdens. And so in doing that, we should not live with regret. If we're living with regret, then what that really means is that there is something that I am not willing to hand over to Christ. It sounds funny because usually we talk about not handing things over to Christ. We talk about sins that I'm not ready to stop doing or temptations I'm not really ready to give up. But in the same way, sometimes we can have regrets that we're not willing to hand over. Christ did not die on a cross, live on this earth, come here, serve the sick and the rejected, and he didn't come here and reject all comfort and all power and authority, due to heavenly powers and whatnot, just so we could sit here and hang on to something in the back of our mind because we feel really bad. Christ came here and died on that cross so that you could experience true freedom from the things that hold you back. We will all experience grief anytime we cause another individual to hurt. We should experience grief. And when we experience that grief, we shouldn't just try to avoid it or ignore it. We should process it so that we can become better people, so we can become more pure reflections of the nature of Christ. But we should be careful not to let that sense of grief become something that slowly drags us down. Because after all, Christ died on that cross so that you wouldn't have to carry that burden anymore. That is why we know Jesus Christ. And if there's something that you're still carrying with you today, then I beg you, please ask yourself, why is it that you feel that Christ cannot carry that burden? Because I promise you, he's carried many burdens much, much greater. That's our lesson that we have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.